tablet for Android, iPad, I mean, iPhone. Yeah. I think large was the right choice. Yeah, the regular large. Yeah. I chose for you. I knew you so well. There's no intramurals. And even if there was, our team didn't have like because last 2 years we won. Because we didn't win either last year. We didn't make the finals. I was like so mad. Yeah, I say you need the middle, so yeah, because I don't think we're gonna be a lot of laptops. We have to use the thing behind that. I have no idea. From what I heard, someone told me that it's not showing up on the thing anymore. So, well, we're thinking about doing like hosting a on-campus tournament though, like asking all the fraternities and like sororities to pair up and all the other things. Think it might work? No. I'm thinking good. To like, there's no intramurals. Ryan's like, or something.
All right, welcome to Lecture 4 of Mobile Sensing and Learning. Class logistics. So assignment 1 is due this Friday. Hopefully it's not a surprise to anyone. So with that, your source code is due to me. Your whole team source code compiled into one big Xcode project is due to me on Blackboard, and you can turn it in via the assignments page. You just click on and upload me a zip file of it. Yeah? Show that to me sometime either in the lab this Wednesday, in my office hours on Wednesday, or my office hours on Friday. As long as you try to show it to me, you know, if you can, show it to me before Friday at 5 o'clock. If there's just something that is barring that, like you're out of town and you can't show me your entire team, then that's kind of a legitimate excuse. Show it to me later, but take a video of it and upload that with Blackboard. Quick video of the UI going through it. Cool? Okay. I have 20 people on Teams and 2 people unassigned at this point, according to Blackboard. Is that right? Are you on a team now, Mr. Jackson? Yeah. Which team are you on?
I'm on King and Doer.
Doer King. Doer?
Door.
Door. Got a red ball. Wrong both times. All right, so Doer King. So I will add you on then. Awesome. Okay. Sounds good. Let me very, very quickly, if you guys go up onto Blackboard right now, under the course documents, when you click on it, everything should come up here, and everything should be in a format, which I finally got with people that are running Blackboard, to make this into a format that is very streamable if you're running from the right web browser. And if your web browser doesn't support some of the streaming that comes from this, you can just download, and it should play on Mac, Windows, whatever. We've tried it on all, okay? So you can download all the videos. I've attached the lectures with them that are right there. And any of the source code that we do, I'm also throwing up there. So if you'll see here on Lecture 3, you'll see that we have a PDF of the slides, the video of the lecture, and all of the example code that we went over. Okay? And I will try to post this as soon as possible after each lecture so you have access to all of that.
Are those videos or just audio?
So those are videos. So those are MP4. They're 640 by 480 videos of everything that you see right here. I'm doing a screen capture of.
What browser do you use? It was just audio and Chrome.
It was just audio in Chrome. It should. You got video? Yeah, I've had Chrome has had issues. Firefox has also told me that the file is corrupt until I download it and it plays just fine. But in Safari it worked 100%. Don't know. Okay, and it also depends on which version of Firefox I was running with the plugins. Anyway. Okay. Questions on that? Good to go. Awesome. Okay, so the agenda today, we're going to try and finish off view controllers. I'm going to go through PageViewController and do a demo of it. We're going to very briefly talk about timers and segmented control. I've got one slide which we'll go over. And then I'm going to go straight into core data, persistent storage. So if you do core data inside of your application for assignment 1. That is optional and it's extra credit. Okay, up to 2 points. Okay, that's a lot. Okay, but if you use it, you can have it. So we're going to go through how to use core data for creating and using basically database schema. Okay, so that you have persistent storage that the user or anything can store into and you can query. It's basically SQLite. If we have time, we'll go into blocks and multi-threading and we'll talk about Objective-C++. Okay, so a page view controller. This is inherently what a page view controller is. It's basically when you have multiple pages of content and you just want to swipe through them. Okay, and usually you'll have a little indicator down at the bottom that tells you which page you're on. Okay, so I'm going to go today how to do that. The first thing that we're going to do is place a UI page view controller in our storyboard. We're then going to place basically a root controller for that page view controller. A root controller is just something that I'm calling it. It's going to be the parent of our UI page control. The next thing we're going to do is instantiate our view controller from that root controller and set the root view controller as the data source for our UI page view controller. Okay, and now I'll go over each of those steps that I just said. So basically, this is the layout that we're going to have. Let's say we have some view controllers down here, and we have a page view controller. That page view controller is going to control each of these different view controllers so that you can slide in between them. Okay? Now, these could be different view controllers, or they could all be the same view controller that I'm instantiating differently. So if I have, let's say it was our image view controller, all of those could be the same image view controller. I'm just instantiating them with different images that they display. Okay, so I can swipe through different images, right? So the page view controller is going to control all of the logic for streaming and scrolling those things over. This root page view controller, we're going to set that down and then subclass it. We are going to set that to be the data source for our page view controller, which means it's going to ask us all the questions about, hey, what page should I be displaying? And we're also going to set this as the parent, and this is the child. And I'll show you how to do all of that. Okay? So when we set down this, these two view controllers, this page view controller is something we just drag out from down here. We'll just drag out a page view controller. It's already set up for us. And then we'll drag out a generic view controller right here. The one thing that I will say is when we select our page view controller, we're going to give it a storyboard ID. And that's going to give us the ability to instantiate this from code. Okay, so rather than relying on Xcode and the storyboard to instantiate all of our view controllers, I'm going to show you how to instantiate this view controller from code. We're not actually going to subclass this page view controller. We're going to use it as is, which is something we don't do. We haven't really done before. But we don't really get that for free because the way that this is set up is it needs this other view controller to be its parent. So we're going to set this as the parent, and then we're going to take this page view controller and set it right on top of the view controller that we have so that the page controller is what is displaying, but all of the logic that it's asking for pages, it's going to go back and ask our root view controller what that is. This will become clear when I do it in code, okay, on what I'm doing here. So inside of this root page view controller, the first thing that we're going to do is instantiate our page view controller. So I'm going to set some properties inside the root view controller, and the first thing I'll do, I'll say, okay, we've got a page view controller that's right here, and then I've got an array of page content. Okay, and I'll talk about what that is a little bit later. But it's basically going to be what I want these view controllers, the view controllers inside of this, to be instantiated with. So this page view controller, it's just a property right now. When I instantiate that, the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to call self.storyboard instantiate view controller with identifier. And that's when we gave it that identifier of page view controller, I'm just going to say, give me an instance of that from the view controller, or from my storyboard. Fair enough? Easy enough? Very easy to do. So I'm going to instantiate it that way, so now it's set up. And then I'm going to set the data source for the page view controller to be me, the root view controller. So all of the delegate methods that it's going to send, like how many pages do I have, and what's the page before this page, all of those questions are going to be sent to the root view controller. So there's instantiation. Inside of view did load, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to send a message to this self.PageViewController, and I'm going to set the first viewcontroller. Right, so this is the first page to display. Right, this is actually, it's not a page, it's actually a separate view controller. Right, so it could have been one of the view controllers we created before, and I just kind of send it in. So this is the presenting view controller. This is the original view controller. That's the first page that I want it to be. And then I'm going to give it a direction for navigation. So this one's going to be navigation direction forward, right? So you're going to be able to navigate this way. You could also do up-down pages, which is a little bit weird, but left to right's fine. Animated no, that just means that when I'm setting this first view controller, don't animate that view controller in, just set it. Okay, and there's not a completion handler for that, and we haven't really talked about completion handlers anyway. The next thing I'm going to do, all right, so I set the first page right here. The next thing I'm going to do is this right here, and what it's going to do is add that page view controller as a child into my root, okay? And it's a little cryptic on some of these things, what I'm doing right here. The first thing is okay, so add child view controller, this underscore page view controller, to me, right, the root view controller. Then add that page view controller's view to my view as a subview, right? So it adds that view on top of everything else that I have in there. And then I'm going to call this method called didMove to parent view controller self. And that's, I'm sending a message to the page view controller to say, don't stay on yourself, come back to me. Okay? You don't have to understand exactly what's going on in here because there's a lot of things behind the scenes that Apple basically says, do these in this order or it won't work. Okay? So there's some stuff behind the scenes that they are doing that need to be called, and that's why these have to be called specifically in this order. But in basically, this is happening is just like I said. The child view controller is getting added to that view. The next thing we're going to do inside of our root page view controller, because now we have set ourself as the data source, that means we're going to have to answer some questions. So we're going to have to answer things like the presentation count for the page view controller, and that's going to be however many pages we want to display, and the presentation index for the page view controller, right? So on presentation, display the first, the 0th view controller. There are some other methods inside of this that we're going to look at here. The first two are, you'll see this method, it's called PageViewController, and we're going to give it the PageViewController here, and it's going to say ViewController before ViewController, this ViewController. That is a lot to take in. What this method is saying is that, so give me the ViewController before this ViewController that I'm sending in right here. So it's going to send me the current ViewController. This is what happens when the user starts to swipe. It needs to know what is the next ViewController that I need to be going at, sir. So this before tells you that I'm swiping basically left to right this way, so I need to know the view controller that was before that page. If that's the first view controller, there is nothing over here. I'm just going to return nil, right? But let's say I'm asking, let's say there's pages after, and I'm asking for this page view controller after the controller. So given this first view controller, what's the next page that I should be displaying? Okay? If you take a lot of time to do this, the UI is going to get laggy, right? But this happens really, really fast. Okay, so inside of these methods, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the view controller that I want it to display, right? So I'm going to dynamically create these view controllers that I want to be paging between. I'm going to set any information in those, right? So if it's a different image that I want to be displaying, I'm going to set the image there when I instantiate those view controllers. And then I'm going to return those created pages. Okay, and this will become really, really clear here in just a second. Okay, so let's go ahead and now use what we just learned in the code and actually go into Xcode and create one of these page view controllers. So, can everybody see that? I didn't turn the lights off this time. Should we sit in the dark? Let's sit in the dark. All right. Okay, so what we have here is actually the view controller that we did last time. Okay, so if I were to run this is the view controller we did last time. where basically, come on. Oh, wow, yeah, iOS Simulator. Let's go to 75% here. Okay, so this is that view controller that we created where basically when I click on that, it comes in and I can drag around these different images, right, from the table. And also, I added this extra little button in here that just takes us to that view controller that had the scroll view in it that we did last time, where all of that stuff was created from code. Okay? And this is on the website too if you want to download it. But basically, this is what's here, right? So each of these are separate image view controllers, and these are what actually, those are the view controllers I'm going to be paging between now. So I'm going to set up a page view controller and just recycle my image view controller as the pages. Okay? Everybody okay with that? Good. Okay, so I'll stop that from running. So the first thing that I need to do is go in here and create a page view controller, right? So I'm going to drag that out onto my storyboard. Here it is. Pretty cool. What's the next thing that I need to do? Does anybody remember? Well, I need to name it, right? So that I can instantiate it inside my root view controller, right? So let's go ahead and give this a name. We'll give it some, we will give it a name that's a storyboard ID. I'm going to call it Page View Controller. Here we go. Great. Okay, so it's called Page View Controller, right? The next thing I need is just a generic view controller right here. This is going to be my root view controller, so the first thing I need to do is subclass it, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So File, New, Objective-C class, UI view controller. I'm going to call this my root view controller. Root page. What's a really good name here? Let's call it Page Data Source View Controller. Okay, maybe that's a little more, right? This is going to be the data source for my view controller. It's also going to be the parent. Next. All right, we'll just put it top level. Okay, so it created these .h and .m files in there. Great. So this view controller, I also need to subclass it. This should be Page Data Source View Controller, right? So now that view controller connects to these .h and .m files. Okay? Init with nib, I don't need anything of that. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is create that page view controller, yeah? All right, so I think I've got a code snippet here. Instantiate. Yes, okay. So this is just a code that I had here. Let's get rid of some of the things here. So what I've done here is, so all I did was create this UI page view controller. Yeah, I named it Page View Controller, and then I'm going to have this thing called content, right? And we'll fill that in just a moment. So the getters for each of these properties now, right? So here's the getter. So my getter for this Page View Controller says, okay, if this Page View Controller doesn't exist, if not Page View Controller, then self.storyboard. Here, let's just make this big. Then I'm going to say self.storyboard instantiate view controller with identifier. Hey, oh yeah, page view controller, right? And that's what we called it in the storyboard. All right, and then I'm going to set the data source as self. I've got a warning here. Why do I have a warning? I've set myself as the data source.
You haven't implemented the data source method?
I have not implemented the data source protocol, right? Remember way back when we talked about protocols last week, right? So this is going to be UI page view controller data source, right? So I'm setting this class to be the data source. Boom, that warning goes away, right? So I'm telling it that I'm going to implement those methods. The page content right here, I'm actually going to set that to be the images that I want it to display, right? So before in this table view controller, one of the things that we did was we had this image names thing, right? And we loaded up those image names into each of the cells in our table. I'm just going to copy this right here because these are the names of the images that we want to display. They're nothing but NS strings. Okay, so this page view controller, so the page content is an NS array. If it doesn't exist, then make an NS array of that. Okay, and then return it. All right. So I'm going to have 3 pages in here. One is going to display that image, the other will display that image, and the other will display that image, and I'm going to be able to page in between them. Okay? Happiness. Questions?
Is that like are those actually the images, or is that like?
Yeah. So those are So in our image assets library, we dragged in those PNGs last time, and the names were MSLC, Research, and UV Banner.
How does the code actually know that it's an image, not just a string?
It doesn't. Right now they are just strings.
Oh, okay.
We have to tell it that those point to the name of an image. Okay? So I'm going to go over here to view did load, and now I have to instantiate everything. So page controller view did load here. So this is the code that we just created. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create this thing, UI view controller. The first view controller I am going to set equal to I'm going to create that view from the 0th index. Okay, that is a function we have not written yet. Okay, that's why you're all looking at me funny. We haven't created that function yet. Basically what I'm going to do is this function, we want it to instantiate one of the pages. Okay, I want to create that view controller and send it right here. Right, so I'm going to create the first view controller. I'm going to create it however we do that, some way. So I'm going to create that image view controller. I'm going to set it into an array here and then put it into the set view controllers. Okay? Are there questions on this? All I'm doing here is that for the page view controller, I'm telling it what the first view controller is, and I've already instantiated it and created it. Okay? Then the next thing we're going to do down here is this. Okay? Where we are adding this page view controller as a child to ourself, adding the view as a subview to our view, and then calling did move to parent view controller. Okay? So up until now, all I've really done is copy code that I had in the slides. Okay? Now what we need to do is create this function and implement some of the protocol methods that we had, right, for this page view controller, controller before, controller after, right? And also how many view control or presentation count and the presentation index. So I've got a page view controller data source option here. Okay, I just inserted a lot of code right here, and I'm going to go through it, not to worry. Okay, so view did load for everything. Okay, now I'm going to put in all of the data source methods, right? So the first ones that we can see are going to be the easy ones here. So the presentation count for the view controller is just going to be that page content, the count of it, right? The length of page content. That's how many pages I have, and I'm going to start on the 0th one. Okay? What is the count of page content, just to make sure you guys are with me? 3. Awesome. Good. Moving on. So then I'm going to do this thing called create view controller from index. Okay? And then the input is going to be an index. Okay? So basically what I'm going to say here is if the index is greater than my page content, I'm just going to return nil. Right? So that means I'm asking for a page that is number 4 out of the 3 pages that I have. So just return nil. Right? Don't allow the user to do that. The next thing I'm going to do is instantiate view controller with identifier some view controller. So right here, this should be my image view controller. Okay? It has no idea what an image view controller is because I haven't imported it. So let's go ahead and import it. So I'm going to import the image viewcontroller.h. So now it knows what image viewcontroller is. And what I'm just going to do is instantiate that from the storyboard in the same way that we did the UI page view controller, right? The only problem is I've called this some view controller, right? So I need to have an identifier for my image view controller. So this is the image view controller, and it does not have a name. So we're going to call it image view controller with one O. All right. Okay, so now here, instead of creating an image view controller, some view controller, I'm going to create an image view controller, right? So now I've instantiated an image view controller. Okay. And vc.PageIndex. Right, so I've named that the view controller. And then what I'm going to do here is in the public API of my image view controller, oh, I did already add this. I added this thing called PageIndex, which is just an unsigned integer. Okay, so basically I'm going to have my page keep track of what index it is, right? And I'm just going to save that as a property in the view controller. Okay? So now when I come along here, I can say that view controller dot page index. So my view controller, which is an image view controller, I'm just going to set it equal to the index that gets passed in. Okay? What have I not done here? I haven't set the content of my image view controller. Right now, it's just, it has no idea what image to load, right? So if you'll remember, I've got this image name inside of my image view controller, right? And what it does is the image that it loads up is UI image, image named, self.image name, right? So all I really need to do is tell my view controller that image name is equal to what? So this is going to be image name is equal to the content at that index, okay? So what I've done here is created an image view controller, instantiated it in code, set up all of the things it needs to load it, and then I'm going to return that view controller. Okay, so now you can see up here when we did this, the first view controller, I said self create view controller from index, create that 0th view controller and start out the page view controller with that, right? So it starts at 0. Right, so this is a pretty cool little function. Now I can implement these data source functions, okay? So this page view controller where it's asking me for the view controller before my current view controller, I can do something like this. I can say, okay, the current view controller, it's passing in to me, okay? So that is an image view controller, right? So what I can do is I can say, okay, it's passing in this image view controller to me. The first thing I can do is cast it as an image view controller. It is an image view controller, right, which inherits from UI view controller. So I can cast it as an image view controller right here, okay? The compiler does not care what view controller I put right here. If I had other different views in here and I tried to cast them as an image view controller and they weren't an image view controller, I would get a runtime error, okay? But the compiler says, yeah, this is just fine. Is everybody okay with that? So I cast it as an image view controller. That means I have access to this page index property, which is in its public API. Question?
What do you need to pass it? Can you just get the index from the view controller?
I can actually, and I could do that, but the compiler would give me a warning because PageIndex isn't implemented in the generic UI view controller class. So this is just kind of a way to get rid of the warning. And for someone reading my code, they're like, oh, I didn't know UI view controller had a PageIndex property inside of it. Right, but here we've explicitly cast it so that they know we're accessing an image view controller. Okay, so if the index equals 0 and it's asking me for the page before it, I'm going to return nil. Right? And also, I can do this index of ns not found, right? Which is this is just kind of keeping me safe right here for this unsigned integer. If that unsigned integer, if this index that it passed in wasn't an index, it should be equal to ns not found. Okay. So I can return nil. I'm going to decrement the index that we have right here, and I'm going to return a new view controller at that new decremented index. Okay? Now what about after view controller? The opposite, right? Plus plus. And I'm going to be checking the bounds for if that index is equal to my count, and I'm asking for the page next, yeah, just return nil. Question? This ns not found, it's just a type def, right? So you can do that with most ns objects. You can say ns not found, don't do anything with it. This, honestly, I could remove all of these and it would function just fine because I'm never passing something in that's not an ns unsigned integer. But if other people are using this code, they pass something in, that would help protect us from that kind of runtime error. Okay? I think we're done. You think this will work? Here. So the way to test this out is I'm just going to say, okay, my initial view controller, I'm just going to set it equal to PageViewController, right? So all of this code is just going to be ignored over here, and it's just going to load up the PageViewController the very first. Let's see if this will work. It's going to run on this. Let's build it first just to make sure it actually builds. Hey, build succeeded. Now let's get a runtime error, just like, what is that? A breakpoint. Oh, I didn't realize. Delete that breakpoint. Hey, all right. So it did load up something that's right here. Oh, my goodness. What's going on here? What's up? What's wrong? It does have a scroll view in it. It does. So what? Maybe I should make this smaller, you mean? Like that? Like that? Oh, what is this ridiculous thing here? Sorry, I knew that was going to happen. So the I'm sorry to do that to you guys. Basically here if I go to the main storyboard, what I've actually done here is, let's look at the properties for this bad boy. It is a transition style page curl. That's not what I wanted. That's for reading stuff, right? That's when you have a book and you're trying to turn pages, okay? So I'm just going to turn this to scrolling. Everybody okay with that, right? And now that subview gets instantiated inside here, so it's fine, everything's good. So let's try it now. Okay. I've got a scroll view inside there. Can it deal with that? Oh my goodness, it can deal with that. Wow. Now what happens when I go to the end? If I try and do this, nothing. But I get that animation for free because I'm returning nil. Good? Where is the page indicator? Well, the page indicator, I didn't set up how it looks, so everything is white. The entire page, it's right down here. There's 3 page indicators, and it's highlighting them with white. Okay? So let's go and fix that. Okay? Here's where we're actually going to go into the AppDelegate. This AppDelegate says, hey, set the universal stuff in here for me, right? For your application that launches. So I'm going to go in here, and you'll see there's this application where did finish launching with options. So right after your application finishes launching, that means right when the user hits it, they don't see anything, right? Let's get this application launched and everything set up with it. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, okay, UI page control equals the appearance. And now I can do this page control page indicator tint color. I'm going to set that equal to light gray, right? So that the whole thing, the tint of the whole thing is light gray. I'm going to set that this page control, the current page indicator is black. And the background of this little thing down at the bottom, it's got a square around it. I'm going to say that's white to match our background. Okay? And now that is universally set, the entire application. Let's see what happens. Ah, well now that's a little easier to see and a little easier for the user to figure out what's going on. Yeah, I'm on the second page, I'm on the third page. Can't go any farther. Questions on PageViewController. Can I click on these? No, they are not clickable.
I think in the home screen there.
On the,
Yeah, on the home screen of the phone.
really?
Yeah, there.
That's pretty cool. I've actually never made these clickable before. One of the reasons that Apple might not want you to do that is because this is the size of my finger. On a phone, yeah, I mean, targeting is inherently, it's kind of difficult for something as precise as this right here. You might be able to do it, but it might not be the best UI design. Are you coming with me on that one? Okay, good. What's that? Is that an iPhone or an Android? I can't see.
It's an iPhone.
It is an iPhone? All right, well, fine. You win.
So is it usual to always reinstantiate the page each time, or if they were heavier,
The PageViewController, it's a little funny the way that it instantiates those views, right? So let's say I was actually able to, let's say I just made this really small, okay? And then I page over one right here. Well, and I can also make this one really, really small. If I page back over, that view controller, it didn't create a new one. The one right before that I just came to, it keeps alive. Okay? So it kept that one alive. So if I go over here, it also kept that one alive. And kept that one alive. But now if I do this, if I go over to this view controller, and now let's say I'll just make that small so that I can page over really easy. It still kept that one alive, but this one is a totally new instantiated view controller. Okay? So is that some of the intricacies on how it's actually, that gets into how the logic of the page view controller works. Yeah. You.
We figured out how the cookie thing works. I don't know how to implement it, but
Oh, okay.
if there's multiple, we made another page. When there's 3 pages, it doesn't just go, but like whichever one you click on, it doesn't go to that page. If you click on the right side of the little 3 dots, it'll move 1 page to the right. If you click on the left
Look at that.
Yeah.
You learn something new every day.
Is there any way to save the state of the page? For example, if one page was like, I don't know, a form or something? Save the state?
You can. And the way that you would do that is you would try to force this you would probably subclass UI PageViewController and make sure that it never gets rid of those instantiations. Like once you've created a page, you want that to be whatever the user had. Okay? Other questions?
So you can change the logic for that.
If you subclass it, you can customize anything you want in it. Yeah, just like in table view, when we subclassed that, and we had full control over all the cells that were there. Anything that Apple deems as a designer, and they expose a lot of different stuff. The things they don't expose are things that have legitimate issues around privacy, what they consider legitimate issues. I've never really had too much of a quandary with what they've done. Okay? But you certainly could. Okay? All right, so that is the PageViewController. Wow. Okay, so that was the page view demo. Assignment 1. You should have everything ready to be completed for assignment 1 now. We've gone over everything except for these 2 little things, UI segmented control and UI and the NS timer. So you have to have a timer and a segmented control there. We're going to do 1 slide on this because you can Google those and figure out how to use them. Question?
Wait, what do you mean automatic layout programmatic?
Oh, this right here? So automatic layout, storyboard and programmatically. That just means that whenever you create like a button slider and a label, if you create them from the program, I still want them to have auto layout constraints, right? So when we talked about that, basically the visual format language
Yeah, but
for how you make those things.
online, I don't think you had programmatically with automatic layout. What if,
Oh, online, it probably just says automatic layout, right? Well, here, let me put it this way. Online, I want it to work in landscape and portrait mode, okay? So if you're adding a label and a button programmatically in a slider, it better still work in layout and portrait mode. I better not be able to break it. The easiest way for me not to be able to break it is to use those visual format constraints, the format language, okay? So that it has automatic layout in it. Okay. So a segmented control. A segmented control is something that looks like this, right? It's an array of basically buttons, right? And they're one hot, okay? Which means you can select one at a time. Okay, so if you were able to, let's say this was a background and I wanted to change the background. I could select, well, my background could be white, gray, yellow, or black. When I set up a action for my segmented control, so I control drag over into my view controller, I can give an IB action, and I just called this, okay, update from segmented control, right? And it sends into me a segmented control sender, which allows me to access some of the functions that are there. So one of the things that I can get is sender, the selected segment index, right? So if I had pressed the white, this selected segment index would be 0, right? If I select black, it would be 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay, it would be the third index. The way that I get the title for what's inside there is I would say sender title for segment at index, the index, right? So now this NS string selected text would either have the string white, gray, yellow, or black inside of it. And I could use that to control my segmented control and do whatever I wanted to. Okay? Happiness? Get the title from the control. Pretty easy. That's all I'm going to talk about with segmented controls. I think they're pretty easy to use. NS timer. What do I mean by a timer? What's a timer? Somebody tell me. Something that counts. That is the best answer I've ever heard. I'm not even kidding. I'm not kidding. That's what it is. That is truly what it is. It is a timer, right? So the way that you would create a timer is you say the schedule timer with interval, right? So you would give it some interval, and what it's going to do is it's going to set up a timer, and it's going to say execute this selector, this function, every X seconds. If I set repeat to no, then it doesn't matter what this interval is, okay? Because it's only gonna, it's gonna, basically what it's gonna do is it's gonna fire off this timer, and then once that timer gets down to 0, let's say after 2 seconds, if I set this to be 2 seconds, it's gonna execute this function. If I set repeat to yes, every 2 seconds, it's going to execute that function, okay? There's some, we might get to it today, we probably won't, but the way that this actually happens is it adds, if you don't tell what run loop, if you don't tell basically what thread on the phone you want your timer to be running on, it's going to run your timer on the main thread, which is where your UI is running, okay? And that means that anytime your UI and the user is doing something on your UI, that's the highest priority for the phone. Your timer stops counting, right? So if I have a table view and I've got some timer that's supposed to fire every 5 seconds, when the user starts scrolling, if they do this thing and they're kind of like scrolling back and forth the entire time that they are interacting, my timer is not counting down, okay? Because it's set on the main UI thread, which takes priority over everything, okay? If you want your timer to run, all you have to do is basically execute this line of code right here, which basically says that, okay, this timer, instead of adding it to the main loop, what I'm going to do is add it to this run loop called basically the main run loop, but give it to the NS run loop common mode, which takes it off of the UI thread. Okay, so it will actually execute every 2 seconds. All right, the UI still gets preference for when it gets executed, and this will become a lot clearer but I wanted to make sure I got to this in this lecture because you have an assignment due Friday. So just add this line of code. If you don't know what it means, by the end of this lecture or next lecture, you will know what we're talking about, because we're going to talk about blocks and we're going to talk about threading. We're going to talk about the main queue. I didn't mean to use the word queue, thread, okay? Because I haven't talked about what queues are yet. Sorry. Thread. Questions on the timer? No questions on the timer. Awesome. Good. Okay. Core data. How many people have dealt with SQL databases? Everybody. Excellent. Okay. This is going to be awesome. And if I go too fast, just yell at me, okay? Okay. So core data is a really powerful part of the iOS framework, and it allows you access to a SQL-like database. You get to define the schema for that database inside of Xcode, right? So all of your tables, all of the relationships, all of the variables, you can do all of that through Xcode. It is integrated deeply into Xcode and iOS. It's probably one of the most powerful frameworks that's there. So we can do advanced queries into our database. We can have all sort of cascading relationships, or what happens on update, or what happens on delete, right? So all of the things that you'd be familiar with if you were executing in a SQL database, you can pretty much do from iOS and Xcode, okay? It's highly optimized, and I do mean that. It is very highly optimized, right? It's basically SQL. And it's going to be excellent for storing persistent table data, right? It's really kind of optimized for that. Let's say you're displaying rows on a table, right? And you want to be querying some database for what each cell should have and display inside of it. It's really optimized for doing those queries on the fly as your user is scrolling through maybe 1,000 songs, like if you're in iTunes, right? If you have 1,000 songs, it's getting access to a database there of the songs and everything that you have, okay? But it's usable for most any kind of data that we have. Okay, so the way that you set up a schema is you first, you create an entity. Okay, so I've created a couple of entities right here. The first entity, you'll see this E right here, is an entity called Teams. Okay, so I created an entity called Teams in Xcode for my data model. And inside Teams, there are two different attributes. The first is the team name, which is a string, and the hardware that that team is using, which is a string. So this would be something for this class. If I want to know all of the different teams that are there, right? All of you guys chose a team name, and you all told me which hardware you're going to use, so I can save that into this database schema, all of the teams. I also created an entity called a student right here. Well, every student right now, if you're going from Blackboard, you guys have a name, and you guys have a major, okay? And so I can put that as an entity, right? I can also define a relationship between the teams that exist and the students that I have in the class right here, right? So what you can see here is, and this is in Xcode, it gives you a visual format for how this looks, right? So the team entity, you can have different members of a team, right? And so those members are going to be students, and it's a one-to-many relationship. There can be many students on one team, okay? The other way, each student just has one team that they can be on, all right? The next thing I can do is go into Xcode and ask it to basically generate subclasses of these entities for me so that I can use them just like I would classes in my code, right? So if I ask it to generate the teams entity, it's going to give me this init managed object, and it's going to say, okay, each team's member has a name, has hardware, and then it has an ins set of members, okay? Right, so that's a set, right? Because I can have a lot of members on one team. Next down on here, I can have a name and a major as part of a student, and they can be part of one team, right here. And so that relationship is taken care of for me. Question?
So it says NSS set. Could you use NSS array? Or
This is auto-generated code, right? So, and you can't, actually. You can't use an NS array. The reason it uses an NS set is because inside of that database, it's not an ordered set, right? It could be added and shuffled around in any matter, right? So a set is different than an array, and just it doesn't have an order. But you can still get the count from it and everything like that. And you could iterate through the objects if you needed to. Yeah, good questions. So when you're working with core data, the first thing you'll do is schema creation. Right? So you create this SQLite database, and you will create it on the phone. You'll go into Xcode, and you'll enable access to all of the different properties of your schema through subclassing. And then we're going to create these different things called an NS managed object, a managed object context, a persistent store, and then we'll talk about what a fetch request is here in just a second. So these three things are what allow you to interact with the database from your phone, okay, from your application, right? So this NS managed object is just a bundle of all of the different data models that you have, right? So the one data model I've already talked about would be my student and teams data model. So, right, so I had a data model, and the entities in that data model were teams and students, right? That's one data model. If I can have other models in there, and basically I would want this NS managed object to bundle all of those data models together so that I could access all of them, okay? The context is basically for being able to get access to all of that data model, right? So I need a managed object context, right? And I'll declare this so that I have access to all of the entities that are inside of those databases. And then I'll create this thing called a persistent store, which is coordinating access between everything I do in my code, right, and this underlying database that is sitting on the phone. All right? And then whenever I want to do fetches from the database, I'll do this thing. I'll create an NS fetch request, and that's going to allow me to create and execute queries on the database. Okay? Pretty easy. There's also another way of using core data, which is through a UI managed documents. And if you want to know how to use that, I promise that this class would be as complementary to the Stanford lectures as possible. I think in the Stanford lectures, they use a UI managed document class. So you can go ahead and figure out how to use that. I'm actually going to go a little bit deeper into working with the database here. Okay? Okay. So let's talk about each of those managed objects, the context, and the persistent store. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a property, which is my managed object context. Okay? And the way that I'm going to instantiate that is I'm going to say, okay, if that managed object context doesn't exist, I'm going to go and I'm going to create an NS persistent store coordinator. Right? And I'm going to call myself to get that persistent store. So this persistent store is another property that I have as part of myself. So self persistent store coordinator, and it's going to grab it. And then as long as that coordinator didn't equal nil, right, I didn't get an error in creating my persistent store, my coordination, then I'm going to create a managed object context. I'm going to alloc init it, and then set the persistent coordinator for that managed object context. Okay, I'm going to do that once. I'm going to do that when my application loads. I'm going to create all of this. So I'm actually going to create all of this in my AppDelegate. All right? Because I only want to do this one time. The persistent store coordinator, the way that, okay, so when it goes in here to self get the persistent store coordinator, the getter for that method looks like this. And all this is really doing is if that persistent store doesn't exist, what I'm going to go and I'm going to get a pointer to our file. All right, so the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to create an NS URL. So a URL is how your program knows where things are stored. So if I have local files, a local database, I can give a URL to that, right? Which is basically where that file is located, right? An NS URL could also be, something out on the network, right? It has to go fetch that if it ever wants to get access to something on the network. But I'm just going to create an NS URL, file URL with path. I'm going to get access to my documents directory, which is on the phone. And I'm just going to append this thing called modelname.sqlite. Okay, so this right here is whatever your model name was. Right? So if my students and teams were inside of a model that was called student teams, this would be studentteams.sqlite or SQLite. Okay? Question?
So when you create that, is that stored like
locally with like the rest of your app data, or is that stored?
It is stored in your app.
So like when someone
Well, it's stored inside of your application documents directory.
so then when someone deletes your app from
When
that-
someone deletes your app, that database is gone, right? There are ways for taking that and being able to kind of like put it in someone's iCloud and things like that. You'll want to use the UI managed documents with core data. Yeah.
What about when they quit the app? Like
It's persistent. As long as they don't delete the app, anything that you've added or put in there remains in there. Yeah. It stays. As long as that app exists, even if you do updates to that app, right, that it still exists in there. The database does. Yeah, question, Matt.
Let's say you have a UI where you might have some labels or fields with just text, but it might not be worth to create a whole database set for it. It's not tables.
Mhm.
Just storing them as text files, another type of persistent storage. What's another option if you don't need the overhead?
So if you're creating something and you really only want to create it once, right? So like let's say it's something that, maybe this is, the pages that you want to have like 15 pages or something that someone can page through. Like one option is to create a database and query that database for all the different pages that are there, right? And to have it persistently stored. Another way is just to create a property list of all of the things that are there. And so that's something that, a property list usually doesn't change, right? Right? So you could use a property list if you wanted to. Another way is you could go into NSUser defaults. Right, so NSUser defaults is another persistent store, but it's really made for storing just a couple of things that the user sets for your application that you want to be your application to always know. Right, so you could go into NSUser defaults and set things like, I don't know, if they set something that has in your application, right? So if they set there's some kind of slider which controls like the background color of your application, and you want to always know what the user has chosen for that. You would set it in NSUser defaults, and then you could query the user defaults, and that's a persistent store. That's right there. But it is not made for storing massive amounts of data, right?
so there's nothing like shared preferences. Yeah, it's an Android.
There's
Like an Android, there's shared preferences.
yeah, so you can, and that's in NSUser defaults. NSUser defaults is kind of like a shared preferences for everything that's in there. It's also how you would like, how some if you're on your iPhone, some applications, you can actually go into the settings menu. That's a special, basically, like NSUser defaults store that happens in your UI settings. Okay, so you can get access to that as well. You just have to tell Xcode that you're going to do it.
And those won't change unless your user deletes your app again.
Yeah, the NSUser defaults. I think the NSUser default, even if they delete your application, I think those might stick around. I'm not sure I've tested that though. And the reason is it's saving it. It's not local to your application where it's saving it. It's saving it in a shared space. Yeah. In Apple land. Yeah. The other thing that we did is I never really created this managed object model, and the getter for that is pretty easily NS managed object model, merge model from bundles, nil. Basically, take all of the models that I have in Xcode and just kind of aggregate them together. Okay? We're going to call, all of these are just going to get called once. Okay? So, entering data. So if we want to add an entity into the table, this is the way that we're going to do it. So let's say we have this teams entity and I want to add a new team into the table. Or into my, well it is a table, but into my database. Okay? The way that I would do that is I would call this thing called NS entity description, insert new object for entity for name teams. Okay? And the reason it knows what teams is because in managed object context, self.managed object context. So I'm going to give it the object context that I created before over here. Okay? All right? So this managed object context. Somehow I'm going to get it access to that context. And then I'm going to say for entity, get me a new entity called teams. Now, because I've subclassed that entity, I can do this. I can do team.name equals whatever. This is self.teamName. Let's say they were entering the team name in a text field. I'm just going to grab the text from that, an NS string, and set it to team.name. Let's say I had this other one, which was assign hardware, which they chose the hardware that they were going to have. I'm going to set that equal to team.hardware. Okay? Which is also an NS string is what it's returning. Right? So now each of these have gotten returned. And now all that I've done is manipulated this class in memory. I have not saved anything to the database yet. When I say self.managedObjectContext save, that's when it gets saved to the database. And it is stored there persistently until someone deletes it. Okay? So it's pretty easy to add something in there. If I wanted to do student, it would be the same thing. Right? So if I would create a new student, I would do for entity student, and it would be student.name, student.major, and I could set it. Okay?
Is that expensive to save? That's if you like change a whole bunch of stuff and then you do save. That's
well, it's not that expensive. Okay, so in terms of like user interface, UI, it's extremely fast compared to like people that are clicking around on a screen, right? It is going and accessing Flash, right? But it's also extremely optimized, so things are getting cached. Right? So if it can go and it doesn't have to, go out and read it from the, flash memory, and it's actually got it, it'll just bring up the cache for it, right? It's like a database. It is a SQLite database running underneath. Extremely optimized. It's as fast as you can get it. Okay?
so there's no harm in doing like these saves
Every time you change something and you want to save it, no, it's not that bad. Unless there's some like wicked cascade that happens between all the different tables that things are updating, and even then, SQL handles it, right? It's a database, right? It can do all of those cascades really, really quickly.
What about the NS error?
Yeah, so NS error, right? So basically I said if not this right here, it's going to return whether it was success or not, right? So if this doesn't happen, then I'm just creating an NS log right here. What you'd actually want to do here is, all I'm doing is just printing this out. If your UI depended on this, you would want to do an assert here and have the app crash, or you would want to handle that error and tell the user that, that didn't get saved, something's wrong. Okay, you'd want to do an assertion right here, or handle the error. Okay. So create a new entity for the model. We set the attributes, and then we save it into the database. Pretty simple, pretty cool. All right, if you want to do a query, all right, so let's see, let's say that the user has created a bunch of teams already in the database, right? If I want to go and get access to all of those teams, well, I'm going to have this function called getAllTeams from database. And the way that I'm going to do that is doing the thing that we talked about called an NS fetch request, right? So I'm going to call this NS fetch request. I'm going to call it fetch request, and I'm going to alloc init it, okay? And then I'm going to set the entity to be queried. So the entity is NS entity description, entity for name, teams, in the managed object context. Okay? Then I'm going to fetch request, set entity, and then I'm going to call this line of code, which is myself.managedObjectContext execute fetch request, fetch request. What that is going to do, because I have not set anything else up right here, it is going to get every single team that is saved in my database and return it right here as an NS array. Okay, so all of those classes. So I could go through there, and every single element in my array is going to have a name, it's going to have hardware, and it's also going to have students that are in that, that team, right? Because that was a relationship. We had a one-to-many. So it's going to have an NS set of students that I could iterate through and see what their names were in their major. As long as I've assigned those students, as long as I've set that relationship somewhere in my program. Okay? Questions on how to just execute everything? How do you do a specific query? How do you do a specific query? Let's talk about it. Oh, well, sorry. Request, entity to request from, do the fetch. Okay, and it gives you an array of results. Even if your database has nothing in it, that array will be size 0. Okay? If nothing got returned from the query. So let's say I wanted to get a team from the database. right? I just want to get that team, right? So let's say I've got some team name that I'm interested in. Well, I'm going to initialize the fetch request just like I did up here, right? Just like that. That's this ... But then now I'm going to do this fetch request.predicate. And the predicate that I'm going to set is an NS predicate with format. And I'm going to say the name has to equal this team name right here. So it's only going to return results to me where the team name is equal to this. Okay? And then when I actually do this fetch request, it'll only return results. It'll be an NS array of teams that have the same name. And that team name is equal to whatever I've sent in right here. I can do all sorts of other different types of predicates too. Right? I could do, so I did this one here where name equals that. I could say the name contains whatever that string is, right? And it'll ignore case. Let's say I had some value in here. So instead of a bunch of strings, I had something that was unsigned integers or doubles or something. I could say, I'll get it where value is greater than 7. I could say where, if this was a student, I could go in and say, I only want students that are on where the team.name equals this. Right? I can go in and access the relationships to go and get the queries, right? Just like you could in a SQL table. Or I could do things like if this was a team where I was setting the predicate here, instead of getting all of these, I could say any where student.name contains some student name. So any of the students in my team have that name, and it would return all of the teams that have that specific student name. Yeah, you'll have to do an NS predicate combine. So you can create, different predicates and then do an and in between them, or an or. Okay, so I am going to do a core data demo. Now remember, this is extra credit for you. So I've got this application which I've called it Who's in That? Okay? And what I've actually done here inside of this is what I did was I created this data model. And the way that I did that was File, New. So I could go to File, New, and then I go down here to Core Data, and I can create a data model, right? So all I did was create a data model. I'm going to go ahead and cancel this. And what it did is it immediately created this data model, and it generically called it model. Okay, I could have named it whatever I wanted. I called it model. Okay. Inside of that, it had all of this stuff in it, which was, it had 0 attributes, right? It was a database with absolutely no function. So I created these attributes, which is a string for name and a URL, right? So this is going to be the movie name, and this is going to be a URL to the movie. Okay? And what this app is meant to do is you enter a movie in it, and if I don't know who's in that movie, I'm going to go and query IMDb and take you to the IMDb page so that you can go and see who's in that movie. Okay? So I want to set that name and URL somewhere in here. The next thing that I did here is once you're on this, I can go to Editor, create NS Managed Object subclass. Okay? So if I click on that, what it does is it says, okay, which data model do you want to use? Well, this data model, my generic data model that I named model. For the entities, I want you to go ahead and create those subclasses for me. I hit next. I'm going to put it in the top level. I actually already did these creations, so I'm going to go ahead and replace those. And now it has created these new things here. So if I go into movie.h, you'll see that I have a movie, and it's got a name and a URL, right? And the implementation for how it accesses each of those is hidden to you. Okay? It's got this thing, it's called @dynamic_name. Okay? You have no idea how it's going in and accessing those for the database, and you don't have to either. Apple in its wisdom has said you don't need to know. Right? And the reason that they've done that is it's highly, highly optimized. Okay? And they don't want you making changes. They don't trust you to make changes. All right? If I go in here to my main storyboard, what you'll see is this is just a generic table view right here. And it's got this little thing. So if I click on this segue, when I hit add, it's going to take me over into this view controller right here, right, which is my Add Movie View Controller, right, or MCD View Controller, right? And all I'm going to do is I'm going to allow the user to type in the name of a movie, and then they can either cancel or hit Add Movie. All right, so if I were to actually run this, Xcode cannot run the selected device. Oh, well, it's because there is no iOS device. Okay, so put it on the Retina. Okay, so I'll put it on the iPhone 4. Hey, look at that. I've actually run this before, and I added 2 movies in here that I thought would be pretty non-controversial. So there's Toy Story, and there's A Bug's Life, right? So if I click on plus right here, it's going to allow me to add a movie. What movie should we look for? Give me something by Disney. That's hilarious. That's pretty awesome. So Frozen. All right, add movie. Look at that. It's already updated in my view controller, right? How did I do that? Let's figure it out. So if I go in here to my view controller, let's look at the public API. Nah, there's nothing in it. Let's go in here to this. Let's get some space. All right, so this view controller, it has an outlet to that movie name text field. And you are more than welcome to look at how to use a UI text field through this code. I'll post this after class so that you have access to it if you want to. But basically, whenever Add Movie is pressed, right, that little Add Movie button, what I'm going to do here is I am going to get a handle to my AppDelegate. Why on earth would I get a handle to the AppDelegate? Because that's where all of my core data stuff is. Okay, so what I can do here is I can say, hey, my UI application, go get, for the shared application that's right here, go get the delegate to that, right? And that's my AppDelegate, which is this code that's up here. Okay, so it's going to go and it's going to get a pointer to that app, which is my delegate that's running. Inside of that, I've added all of this cool little stuff here, right? So the public API says that there's a managed object model for this app. There's a managed object context, a persistent store coordinator, which we talked about, and then there's this function, get all movies from the model, which just goes and queries it without a predicate. Okay? So each of those implementations are in here. The first thing I do is I synthesize all of those methods right here, right? I include core data. I've imported it. And now these are just the exact code that we saw on the slides, right? I have a managed object context that gets created. And here, inside of my persistent store coordinator, we have to point it towards the database that exists. And that database is called model.sqlite. All right? If you got nothing else out of this class, you got these lines of code so that you can create your own data model, even if you don't understand what it's doing. Okay? So now, inside of this view controller, maybe it's a little more obvious why I'm getting this app delegate, right? So this MCD app delegate, right, which I've included up here, I've imported that so that I know what that is. That allows me to call AppDelegate.managedObjectContext for my entity. So I've also imported this movie thing right here so that I can get this movie class. So I create a movie. The NS entity description, insert new object for entity called movie, right? And movie has the properties name, and movie has the properties URL, okay? So what I'm doing here is I'm creating the movie name right here, and the URL that I'm specifying in here is all I'm doing is http www.imdb.com, find, and I do my own little query here, right? So I do a little GET request. Right, so I'm going to take my user to the search page for IMDb, and that query is going to be the %at, which will be the movie name. Right, so I query it, and I'll just take them to the web page. The next thing I do is appdelegate.managedObjectContext save. Right, because if I don't do that, it's not saved in the database. Happiness? The next thing I do is after, because now they've pressed this add movie button, is I dismiss myself. Okay, we never talked about that before, but if you want to get an example of how to use modal view controllers instead of push, download the source code for this, you'll have access to it. Okay? So, now what happens? So let's run this again. Now, inside here, I'm displaying all of the results that are in the database, right? So this view controller, this table view controller, had to go and query the database for all of the stuff that's in here, right? I can add another movie in here, and it will update in there. What movie should I add now? Give me a Pixar movie. Wow, everyone's like, Wall-E. Is it dash E or dash E? I think. I don't know if I. We'll see if this works. All right, Wall-E. There it is. If I click on these, I'm not connected to the internet, so I'm just going to do here, and it's going to be like, hey, I'm trying to connect to the internet. It's never going to be able to connect to imgp.com. I promise this does work. So back. Who was in that? What I'll do here is let's go over to this video here, and I will give you a reversed view of everything that exists right here. Wow, that is the most pixelated thing I've ever seen in my life. But here you can see there's this who's in that, and it says Toy Story backwards. Oh, wow, yeah. I promise you, if I click Toy Story, what it'll do is bring up IMDb, okay, for a search of Toy. So it actually does work, and if I had internet here, they're not going to provision my laptop. Even your faculty member, they're like, no, we're not doing it for the Wi-Fi. Anyway, so that's that. Okay. And I could create this, and it's going to go and query IMDb for all of that stuff. The reason that I was able to kind of go in here and do all of that was inside of my table view controller, right, which is my table view, I have to tell it all of the cells that I want to be there. So I have this thing called movies, which is an NS array. Okay, and I do some lazy instantiation of that array of movies, right? So if that doesn't exist, then I go in here, I get the delegate so that I can have a context, right? And actually all I do is I call AppDelegate get all movies from model, right? So I execute that fetch request without a predicate, right? So if I go in here and look at what that function looks like, it's going to look very, very similar to what I had from my code, right? I create a fetch request, the identity for movie in self.manageObjectContext. Then I get a fetched records array, and I return that NS array. Get all the movies in my database, right? So I do that here. I can get all of the movies in my database, and I will return those movies. Then what I do is inside view will appear, right? You'll notice this is not in view did load. Inside view will appear, I also update movies and then tell my table to reload. Why would I do that in view will appear?
You add movies, so you pull it back from the dismissal to reload.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, whenever I go to my add movie view controller, if I didn't have this in view will appear, right? This gets called every time that view is about to appear, then my table data would be all out of sync, right? So I reload the table data from this movies, right? So the number of sections that I have is equal to 1, right? The number of rows in each section, well, I've just got one section, and it's equal to the count of how many movies I have, self.movies. And then in here, inside my table view self-row at index path, I can call this function where it's movie equals movie self.movies at my index path dot row. Is everybody okay with that? You remember this? Querying back for UI table view. What it does is I get this movie right here from the index path that the table is asking me for. I set the name, and I also set some detailed text label, right? And that's actually the movie URL, right? Now, that didn't actually show up, this detailed text label, right? Right? All I remember is Toy Story movie, right? So inside of my main storyboard, if I wanted that to show up, I would have to select that cell that I'm doing and set some properties of that cell. So right now, the style of that is basic, but I could change it to subtitle, and it will display the detailed text. So now if I were to run this, let's hope it doesn't crash. I've actually not tried this. Yeah, it's also going to display the URL down below for each of those. Okay? Happiness? Right? There's also some stuff where I actually, you can look in here to see how I did this in this prepare for segue function. I go ahead and instantiate my WebViewController, and I just set the URL, right? So I instantiate the view controller, I get an access to the movie from my selected row, and I set, my view controller URL from parent is equal to movie.url, and that way when it loads, it knows which URL to load. Okay, so that's all there in Prepare for Segue. You guys can take a look at this. I am also going to post up some code. Let's see here, file, open recent, class teams core data. So all of that stuff that we saw before where I'm going to go ahead and post this thing up right here. But if you want to see a more complicated core data example, basically those teams, right? So one of the things that I've done here is I've created a tab view controller where I can add teams, right? So, well, I can add different teams that are in here and team names, the hardware that they're using. I can add students. They have a name and a major that are on there. And then I can access all of those. So Team CHC, you guys are the first ones to email me. So you guys are the ones. That is Connor, Hunter, and Chelsea. I can assign those. Right, so now Team CHC has 3 members. All of those relationships are uploaded and in the database, and it remembers them. If I were to select that again, it would remember who they were. Right, so I can go to cancel right here. The default, that's me. I'm in Team Default. These are in Team CHC. And then Gavin, Hector, you guys were both in. You're the first students in the class because of the B and the C. So I got you in there. Okay. But I will post the source code for all of this up there if you do want to see a relationship example on how to do all of that. Good? Happiness? Next time we'll talk about threads and blocks.
So I